Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I have another full-length review of an Agatha Christie novel, this time Crooked House, celebrating its 75th anniversary in 2024. This is widely considered one of Christie's best novels, but it probably is like the least well-known book from like Christie's top tier. It is a standalone, which is probably the reason for that. Crooked House, to me, is like one of the best Christie novels. It is her best traditional mystery novel that like doesn't feature like Poirot or Marple, and to be honest, is better than every Miss Marple at least. I'll get more into it, but what I love about this book is just like how stripped down it is. There's nothing but the story in this book. There are no red herrings, there are no descriptive passages, there's not even a lot of character development, but there's good character work. It's only plot. Christie needed no bells and whistles here. And as a reminder, I will begin with a spoiler-free summary until the point I reveal the killer, and I will warn you when that happens, and from that point forward, spoilers are fair game. And before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. Crooked House begins in the midst of World War II, where Charles Hayward is serving in Cairo on a diplomatic mission. He meets Sophia Leonides, who works for the Foreign Office. The two fall in love but agree to hold off on marriage until the end of the war. Skip forward 2 years, the war is over, and Charles and Sophia reunite. Charles notices an odd occurrence in the newspaper. Sophia's grandfather, the wealthy restaurateur Aristide Leonides, has died, and there are two obituaries, one posted by his much younger wife Brenda, and a second from the rest of the family. Sophia tells Charles they cannot marry because her grandfather didn't just die, he was likely murdered, and suspicion falls within Aristide's large and eccentric family, including on Sophia. This cloud of suspicion is a focus in so many Christie novels. The effects of suspicion on the innocent and their potentially ruined lives is a motivating factor for both Poirot and Marple. As Sophia explains, her grandfather died probably from esserine poisoning when his wife Brenda somehow injected him with esserine eye drops instead of his usual insulin shot. Brenda is the easy target, not only because she's about 50 years younger than Aristide, but because she is the outsider amongst the family. If Brenda were the murderer, that's the easiest thing for everyone. However, Sophia does not really believe Brenda actually killed her grandfather. Anyone could have switched the bottles, and moreover, Brenda sought help immediately. She also didn't clear out the bottle or the syringe, which a guilty person would have done. Sophia refuses to marry Charles until the murder is cleared up. In the one bit of like convenient coincidence in this book, Charles's father, whom he calls the old man affectionately, just happens to be the assistant commissioner of Scotland Yard, overseeing the case, which is led by Inspector Taverner. The three decide the investigation is going absolutely nowhere. The big problems are alibis, as they are useless. Someone switched the bottles of insulin and esserine around, and since it's unknown when that happened, no one can alibi themselves. The other issue is motive. Aristide was very generous with his money, so killing him for an inheritance seems unnecessary. It is mentioned repeatedly that Aristide is not a fool, however, and refused to give money to what he considered worthless causes. The old man places Charles within the house. Since Charles has a personal connection with the family via Sophia, but is also an outsider, it is decided that Charles should plant himself in the house to investigate. The police don't think this murder can be solved by traditional police tactics. There is a psychological element at play the police cannot uncover. Sophia agrees to bring Charles in, and in a bit of humor, Charles asks, well, like, how does he explain his presence? And she's basically, well, you don't have to because everyone is so self-centered they won't even notice you, which is basically what happens. Sophia is glad to have Charles around, but she's also apprehensive. Charles is mixing business and personal, which she doesn't like, and she's also embarrassed by her family because they are eccentric, and Sophia's words, ruthless. We meet Aunt Edith, who is Sophia's grandmother's sister, who moved in to help raise the children 40 years ago and has since stayed. He meets Sophia's parents, Philip and Magda. Philip is a bit of a recluse with his nose in a book, and he writes like histories of things no one cares about and doesn't make any money. Magda is a terrible actress who and her father-in-law's finances her plays, but he doesn't always get along with her plays. He doesn't agree that they're all good, and moreover, Magda has a terrible time relating with other actors, so her father-in-law essentially like has to fund her productions because she can't get cast any other way. Magda thinks everything is a production for her to star in, including her father-in-law's murder. She even speculates that she should finally put on that Edith Thompson play because it would be so ironic and sensational now. Edith Thompson was an alleged poisoner in real life. Charles also meets Sophia's aunt and uncle, Roger and Clemency. Roger is now the one in charge of the family catering business, and Clemency is some kind of scientist. Roger and Clemency live in a part of a house that's almost completely bare. Like, Clemency doesn't like anything, really. She's described as Spartan a lot. The most important meeting Charles has on the first day is with Brenda, Aristide's second wife. Brenda is the obvious culprit because she was so much younger than Aristide. She's the outsider, and she administered the shot. And most importantly, there is a rumor that she's been fooling around with Lawrence Brown, who is the tutor to Sophia's younger brother and sister. Brenda opens up to Charles because she has no one else to talk to. She tells him about how she met Aristide when she was working as a waitress. She thought she was pregnant, and he agreed to help her by marrying her, but then it turned out she wasn't pregnant, and they married anyway. We really get the sense that Brenda is not this gold-digging harlot she's made out to be. Charles gains a lot of sympathy for her, and much to Sophia's annoyance. Sophia accuses Charles of falling for Brenda's spell with a sob story. And then we finally meet Sophia's younger sister, Josephine. Josephine is about 12 years old and is one of Christie's ugly children. Almost every child of importance in a Christie novel is described as ugly and weird. And we see this in Pearl at End House, Halloween Party, Dead Man's Folly, just to name a few. Josephine is literally described as a goblin. And she's probably the best example of Christie's terrible children. She says she doesn't even care that her grandfather is dead because he didn't want to pay for her ballet lessons because she'd be a terrible dancer. And Josephine is very clearly starved for attention, as no one pays any attention to her. And she tells Charles that she's playing detective and she knows who killed her grandfather, but she's not saying anything because she needs to collect the evidence first. And she's been recording this evidence in her notebook. She does, however, drop quite a few hints to Charles, specifically that she can confirm Brenda and Lawrence are lovers because she saw sappy love letters between the two of them, but she won't say where she saw them. And she also says that her Uncle Roger and Aunt Clemency were about to flee to the Caribbean because Roger is embezzling from the catering business. For whatever reason, Charles thinks Josephine is lying about the love letters, but not about Roger. Charles reports this information back to his father, who doesn't really believe Roger is a murderer. The old man talks a lot about the psychology of a murderer and how they are cocky and lonely. They want to talk about what they did and brag about it, but they can't, so they drop hints. Christie would soon use this very same psychological profile in Mrs. McGinty's Dead, and this is something Christie does a lot in her books, focusing on who could and could not be a murderer based on psychology. Roger does not fit this profile at all. He's too much of a, for lack of a better word, a namby-pamby. However, Clemency is more likely to be a murderer to protect her husband. However, this is all for naught because further detection reveals that Roger wasn't actually embezzling from the catering company. He just sucks at running the catering business, which is near bankruptcy. Roger and Clemency were going to flee to the Caribbean because Roger was so embarrassed about ruining his father's pride and joy and for disappointing Aristide for not living up to his expectations. He couldn't face his father. However, Aristide found out and agreed to give Roger the money to cover the losses. Aristide's death has now delayed that money, so Roger had more reason to keep his father alive. So the police are now back to square one, which is still Brenda. They have no evidence to arrest either Brenda or Lawrence. As much as everyone hopes it's Brenda, only Roger openly incriminates her to the police. When it comes time to read Aristide's will, no one can find it. The lawyer says he never received it. The family says Aristide sent it to the lawyer, and they all witnessed him signing it. However, he apparently sent it to the bank, but the bank doesn't have it either. Everyone knows the contents of the will. Aunt Edith and Brenda get money, with Brenda also getting the house. The bulk of the estate is split evenly, with 1/3 going to Philip, 1/3 going to Roger, and the last third split evenly between Sophia, Eustace, and Josephine. Magda suggests that Brenda destroyed the will because if Aristide dies intestate, that is, without a will, Brenda will get everything as the wife. However, there's no proof she actually did this. The tension between Charles and Sophia continues to grow. Charles still insists Brenda is innocent and begins to feel bad for her and recognizes her as a fearful, lonely woman. This angers Sophia, who constantly is berating Charles for not believing the killer is Brenda, even though she too doesn't really think so. Josephine continues to be an annoying little brat. She still insists she knows who the killer is, but won't say so because the detective never does until the end of the book. And she berates everyone for being an idiot and not seeing what's going on. This felt a lot like Christie breaking the fourth wall with Josephine here, but not in a cheesy way. And the old man warns Charles that he needs to watch Josephine because Josephine is a child who doesn't understand the danger she's in by, loudly proclaiming she knows things. And with the lack of any leads, Charles begins to suspect Sophia's parents, Philip and Magda. He doesn't have too much to go on, but he suspects Philip because he's the one person who isn't speaking to him, which is completely counter to what the old man said a murderer would do, but nonetheless. He's also suspicious of Magda because she, all of a sudden wants to send Josephine abroad to Switzerland, which Charles interprets as Magda wanting Josephine, out of the house because she knows too much and might spill it, meaning that Josephine's presence in the house is a direct danger to Magda. The issue of the will pops up yet again. The family witnessed Aristide sign the will as well as two servants, but when the will turns up, it's actually blank. The real will does eventually turn up in the hands of an old friend whom Aristide trusted, much to the chagrin of his lawyer. The lawyer, Mr. Gateskill, is actually quite funny in his indignation over not being trusted with the will. The will leaves some money to Brenda, but left the entire estate to Sophia. Aristide recognized his family as incapable of handling money and put Sophia in charge because she's the wisest and most responsible. She can essentially take his place as head of the family. Christie's used this kind of will trickery before in other novels, though not specifically like this. Christie plays around with wills quite a fair bit in her novels. Charles' thoughts on what this means for his fiancée are interrupted when Sophia calls to tell him that Josephine has been knocked unconscious. She had been teasing that a second murder was just about due because that's what happens in mystery novels. And for a very serious book, Christie does have a lot of fun with Josephine and her commentary on mystery novels. In some ways, Josephine serves as a bit of the Aaron A. Oliver character. I don't think Josephine is necessarily having the same thoughts as Christie, but Christie is doing a fair bit of lampshading with Josephine. Now, Josephine is only minorly injured. She had a habit of swinging from the door frame of an unused wash house, and it appears someone booby-trapped this with a marble lion doorstop, which very much reminded me of the marble bear clock from And Then There Were None. Anybody could have set the trap, but interestingly, it's the kind of trap that was likely to fail, so it only succeeded by pure chance here. There are divots in the ground nearby, as if the culprit tried this trap many times before leaving it alone, and there's a muddy chair also nearby, as if the killer had to use it to step on to reach the top of the door, and that's really strange because the door is actually quite short, pretty much everybody can reach it. Charles is now very eager to locate Josephine's notebook that she wrote the secrets in. It's likely she wrote whatever she knew in there, but he can't find it, and Josephine's room has been ransacked, so someone else had been looking for it. Charles remembers seeing Josephine come out of the cistern and believes she was hiding her notebook there. Instead, however, he finds the love letters between Brenda and Lawrence, confirming that they have at least a romantic connection, if not having an outright affair. Brenda writes how she and Lawrence can be together soon because Aristide is old and will die soon. It's not exactly a smoking gun, but pretty close to it for Brenda and Lawrence. Inspector Taverner is certain the killer's Lawrence because both Aristide's death and attempt on Josephine feel very cowardly to him. Lawrence, being a conscientious objector, has this cowardly reputation about him, at least in Taverner's eyes. These attempts didn't require the actual culprit to be on hand at the time. Meanwhile, the family is informed about the will. Roger and Clemency are super excited to be disinherited. They do not care at all, and it's such a relief to them. I can't say I would feel the same, but Philip, however, is angry his father once again overlooked him, while Magda immediately begins kissing up to Sophia. Eustace is also pretty angry. Sophia, however, takes this in stride. While she isn't happy to be in control of the family fortune, largely because she was hoping to just get away from them, she does assume the responsibility and takes up her grandfather's place. She says she will continue to deny her mother money for the Edith Thompson play and will not bail out Associated Catering. A couple of days later, the police arrest Brenda and Lawrence for the murder. When Brenda gets taken away, it's a really heartbreaking scene here with her simply just being terrified and Charles feeling particularly sorry for her. It reminded me a lot of what happens when they arrest in Ordeal, not Toward Zero, Audrey Strange, I think it is, Neville's first wife, gets arrested. It's very similar to that scene. However, Inspector Taverner and the old man, they're still not totally convinced it's Brenda and Lawrence. They cannot figure out which one of the two, actually did the deed. The family refuses to say outright they think Brenda is innocent. Aunt Edith, in particular, is very concerned about Brenda having the right lawyers, and she questions Charles about how sure the police are and what are the odds Brenda could be acquitted. Charles takes things to mean that, they don't really believe it's Brenda. Lawrence gets a lot less sympathy from Aunt Edith, and I'll talk more about him in the character section later, but I find Lawrence's portrayal very unique and intriguing for Christie. Aunt Edith doesn't care at all what happens to Lawrence. I should also add that Sophia immediately fired Lawrence once she took control of the money because Eustace is going to a school and Josephine is going to be sent to Switzerland. Josephine returns home from the hospital that same day, and Charles feels bad that she missed all the action of the arrest, and she says, well, she already knew everything that happened anyway. And she knew Brenda and Lawrence had been arrested because she saw the police car pass them on the road, and she knew all about the real will because she listens at keyholes. She also tells Charles that she didn't hide the letters in the cistern, that Lawrence did that himself. Charles visits his father to discuss the course of action next when Sophia calls in a panic. Charles assumes there was another attempt on Josephine's life, and he's right, only she's safe. Someone poisoned her cocoa, which had actually been drunk by the nanny, who is dead. And I didn't really mention Nanny as she didn't, factor into the plot up until this point, but she appears every now and then for, domestic purposes. And this feels like a good place to end the spoiler-free summary. If you don't want to be spoiled, back out now and read this book because it's very good. You're missing out. And spoilers are coming from this point forward, so you have been warned. Nanny died from digitalin poisoning, which is a staple in mystery novels. Digitalin is a heart medication, specifically the heart medication that Aunt Edith was taking. This happens very close to the end of the book, so we don't get into the mechanics of this really, but most importantly, Nanny's death clears Brenda and Lawrence because they're in jail when this happened, so they couldn't have done it. And not 5 minutes after Nanny's body is taken out of the house, Roger and Clemency announce they're leaving for London and then the Caribbean that night, which seems extremely suspicious, with Clemency not even realizing that this second murder means they can't leave again. Charles grows even more concerned for Josephine. It was her cocoa that was poisoned, and she narrowly averted death again. Josephine now says she knows everything, but she's still not going to say anything because she wants the big drawing room announcement, a summation gathering, just like in the books. Charles gets angry with her, but Josephine doesn't care about her own safety. Aunt Edith decides to take Josephine out for an ice cream to keep her safe for the afternoon. And I don't know why this wasn't a big red flag for Charles or for anyone else, but they let her go. And Aunt Edith, really should have been a prime suspect at this point, since it was her medication used to poison Nanny, and she pretty openly hated Aristide. But Josephine goes with Aunt Edith for ice cream, and they don't return home. Aunt Edith apparently drove the car into a quarry, killing both her and Josephine. Sophia surmised this as she realized Aunt Edith, when she said goodbye to her when she left, it was in a heartfelt way, as if this was a final goodbye, not the way one says goodbye just to go out for ice cream. Aunt Edith left behind 2 letters. The first is addressed to the police, in which she confesses to murdering Aristide and Nanny. The police accept this, but Charles and Sophia very much see through this, and they have the epiphany that the murderer was really Josephine. Indeed, the second letter is addressed to Charles, in which Aunt Edith confesses that she knew it was Josephine and killed her because she wanted to spare Josephine the tragedy of being discovered and having to go to a reform school or an asylum, as it would inevitably happen. Josephine couldn't get away with it for much longer. Aunt Edith found Josephine's notebook in which she wrote she killed grandfather. It's a very chilling line, actually. Today I killed grandfather. And she did this because Aristide wouldn't pay for her ballet lessons she wanted, so she killed him so the family could move to London, where her family would let her take ballet lessons. And she also killed Nanny because Nanny encouraged Magda to send her to Switzerland, and because Nanny called her a silly little girl. She orchestrated the attempt on her life, which makes sense. Only Josephine is sure enough to need the chair to reach the door frame. Josephine writes a lot about what she did, including like mocking the police and Charles for being idiots and for thinking Brenda and Lawrence did it. Josephine is the only person in the book who fit the old man's characteristics of a murderer. She kept talking about it and seeking attention. Charles even speculates that she killed Nanny because she missed the fun of the murder after Brenda and Lawrence were arrested. More about Josephine in the characters section, but she's definitely a psychopath. Charles and Sophia agree to marry now that this is all over. In a way, it's over for the best. Charles confesses to the old man that it was Josephine because the official answer given by the police is that it was Aunt Edith. They stick with the Aunt Edith story. But the old man admits that he kind of did suspect Josephine the whole time, but just like couldn't wrap his head around a child being a murderer here, sort of implying like he didn't know how to handle the situation properly. The end. I have so much praise for this book. This is one of the best Christie novels, and it's universally looked at that way. I have it at number 2 of the 21 Christie novels that are not Poirot or Marples, and it's probably like 6 or 7 overall. What Christie accomplishes in this book is genius and had a high degree of difficulty. It's difficult to write an interesting and intriguing mystery novel without having to resort to these like gonzo tricks. Christie does not use red herring subplots in this book. There's no weird contraptions, elaborate costuming, mischief regarding like the time of death. This is the rare Christie novel where everything is as it appears to be. And although this sounds simple, it's actually much more difficult than using these tricks. There's nowhere to hide. Christie has to obfuscate the plot via character work, and that's what she does. We are given constant descriptions of what murderers are like, and the only person who fits the bill is Josephine. But we're not looking at Josephine because she's a child. And when there's a brief moment that we're warned that, like, maybe we should suspect a child, it's in reference to Eustace. Christie does such a good job constructing this murder in such a way that readers will not solve it, but readers will also believe a child developed this plan and pulled it off. It can't be too easy because readers will solve it, but a clever murder plot is just simply too advanced for a 12-year-old girl who can't spell ballet correctly. This is some of Christie's best character work. Every character, even like the police inspectors, brings something to the table. No one is wasted. No one is there simply because Christie needed more suspects. Each character is so well developed, I feel as if I know everything about them from just 1 or 2 short sentences. I'll get more into them in their individual sections, but these are some of Christie's greatest characters. In the near future, I will be putting out a video on Christie's greatest one-time, non-murderer, non-victim characters, and I'm certain multiple characters from this book will make the list. Josephine is such a chilling murderer, and it's not just because she's a child, it's the way she's, just as greedy and ruthless as the rest of the family. And we have my favorite setting for a mystery novel, the post-World War II England, and it feels like it. Christie is able to depict this time setting without being heavy-handed. Three Gables, that is the name of the house, is a little run down. The Leonides are living together because the Blitz forced them to. We don't get a lot of food rationing talks in this one, but we do get a lot of tax and death duty talk. I think the time setting is so well done. This book could only take place during this time period. And this book is truly a wonder amongst mystery novels, and really all novels. I have very little criticism of this book. I have no notes, and I struggled to come up with something to fill this section. The biggest issue for me, and it's not that big of a knock for Crooked House as it would be for others, but the murder mechanics in this book actually would not work. I have dozens of books about Christie books, and I'm not certain, which of those books says this, but I think it's probably A is for Arsenic, which is all about Christie's poisons, written by Catherine Harkup, but you need a lot of esterine to poison someone. A syringe full would not work, and the way Aristide's death is described is also inaccurate. This isn't a big deal for me in this book because I wouldn't have known that from just reading the book or from common knowledge. This isn't a case where the mechanics are failing because they don't make sense. And this has happened sometimes in Christie when she's primarily focusing on character and the mystery is secondary. Sad Cypress, Ordeal by Innocence, Five Little Pigs, The Hollow are all character driven that either have like murder mechanics that don't really work, or they do work, but they're just not like as satisfying and ingenious as they would be otherwise. The other little ding here is the ending. Not that I don't like the ending, because I think it's absolutely wonderful, but Charles is just told who the murderer is in Aunt Edith's letter. It's much less satisfying than him like solving it out on his own. This book is solvable. Absolutely, it is. So I do wish Christie would have gotten there before he was told. Now, the murderer is a child, so this is a bit extraordinary circumstances. And to be fair, he does sort of figure it out when he's reading Annie's first letter, but that's like literally like 2 paragraphs before she tells him. Again, not a big deal for me in the context of this book, as it might have been with others. This is a unique novel that can get away with it. Moving on to characters, Charles Hayward is our first person narrator, and I felt he was pretty good. Crooked House is a turning point of sorts for Christie. Prior to this book, Christie would insert Poirot in a lot of books she felt like he didn't need to be in because he was popular and he made her a lot of money. But beginning around this time, we see Poirot less and less. Crooked House is a book Christie would have inserted Poirot in if she wrote it in the 30s, but she resists the temptation here, and it's for the better. Poirot and Marple are the stars of their novels, and this book doesn't need a star. They would get in the way, which is why I think Charles Hayward works so well. He's bland enough to not steal the show, but smart and interesting enough to not be a dud. He's a great narrator. Christie does first-person male narrators better than a lot of male writers do. Charles is not an idiot. He doesn't really have those, like, dodo moments Hastings does. He misses the killer for the same reasons the reader does. And I believe he is personally involved in the case because of his connection with Sophia, but also distant enough to be unbiased and discerning. He has human moments of remorse, particularly regarding Brenda, but also that policeman's instinct to put his feelings aside. His father, Arthur Hayward, the old man affectionately, is also another really good character. He's very much not the typical police inspector we see. Inspector Taverner is more like that. I'm not going to talk about him, but, he's actually a lot more discerning and less brash than most. He's not satisfied at all with the investigation Taverner is doing. He knows that this case is purely psychological, and he needs someone on the inside. He's not the stubborn police officer who's domineering and refuses to think outside the box. He would have loved to have had, like, Miss Marple on this case, probably. He's definitely like Sir Henry Clithering of this book. I enjoyed the fatherly way toward Charles, trying to push him toward Josephine. I believe the old man did know it was Josephine and wanted proof. This happens occasionally in crime novels where someone says they knew it the whole time, but, like, very common with Roger Sheringham from the Anthony Barclay Cox books, but, I just don't buy it most of the time, but here I do buy it. I do believe the old man knew it was Josephine and just, like, couldn't, like, wrap his head around it and didn't know what to do about it. Let's talk about our murderer, Josephine Leonides. She's a great character. I had her at number 37 of 100 Christie killers, and that feels about right. Another one of Christie's ugly children. Josephine is both this, like, wonderful mix of deviously intelligent, but also of, like, missing the picture. We're told she's smart and she knows a lot of things, especially about, like, poisoners, which should have been a big red flag there, yet she misspells ballet in her journal. Sophia sums her up perfectly when she says Josephine was just sad but pathetic. Christie does such a good job of throwing Josephine in our face and making her act like how the old man said a killer would act, but not making it obvious at all. Josephine had to be a child to make this work. This would fail with an adult killer, and it's interesting that Christie did not begin working on this novel with Josephine as the killer. That was a decision she made later in development. Josephine is definitely one of Christie's creepier murderers. I can picture her goblin-like self, like, jumping around, hiding things, spying on people, and you think it's so cute she's playing detective, and maybe it's a little annoying, but then there's just something so much more sinister going on with her. Josephine is one of those best fictional child killers out there, and this is sort of a common trope nowadays, but I think it's done all wrong. It's done to be shocking, and it is shocking in Crooked House, but yet Christie writes Josephine in a way that it's not shocking either. The reveal of Josephine as a killer, again, is shocking, but it doesn't come out of nowhere. It's shocking in the way most Christie reveals are, and not some, like, grand shocking moment just to shock you. When you learn it's Josephine, you feel satisfied. You're like, yeah, that makes sense. Our main victim is Aristide Leonidas, who has an interesting depiction. We never meet him. He's one of those Christie victims whom everything we know about him is told to us through the lenses of other people. And I love when Christie does this. It's so interesting, and she usually does this to give us a false impression of the victim, to throw us off, but here we get the right impression. Aristide is this gentle-handed tyrant. He's not like Simeon Lee or Luther Krakenthorpe, the sort of older, mean man who controls the family's money and doesn't let his children do anything fun. We're told Aristide is a nice person. He's generous with his money, but he's not a fool. He's not going to waste money on Magda's terrible plays or Josephine's ballet lessons, but he will shell out money for worthy causes. And we see this with his relationship with Brenda. Brenda is an alleged gold digger, but yet we're told Aristide is the one who started this relationship because he felt bad for the situation Brenda was in. And we're told Aristide is not a fool, thus Brenda is not guilty of murdering him, and she is not a gold digger. The other Christie victim he reminds me of most is Emily Arundel from Dumb Witness, who was also this wealthy, person and disinherited her family, albeit for different reasons. Aristide is always right, and he was right to put Sophia in charge of the family money. And he was right about Josephine. His presence in the book looms large, even though he doesn't actually appear in the flesh, and Christie does such a good job with that. Our second victim is Janet Rowe, aka Nanny, and we don't know much about her. She wasn't in the book that too much before her death, and we don't even know a lot about her. But she too was always right. Like Aristide, she was concerned about Josephine, and she winds up being murdered by Josephine because Nanny called her a silly girl and wanted to send her to Switzerland. And this says a lot more about Josephine than it does about Nanny. Nanny really just serves as another clue toward Josephine. First of all, she's the only in the house for Josephine, and Josephine was with her right before she died. The cocoa she drank was Josephine's, and it stands to reason if Nanny didn't poison it, then only Josephine could have. But other than that, there's not much character going on with Nanny here. Might sound like a broken record here, but Sophia Leonidas is another great character. I'm not sure if she's as entertaining or intriguing as the rest of her family, but she is very well drawn. We've seen in past Christie women holding the purse strings, but never like this. Sophia might be the first Christie woman to be in control of an estate when there are other male potential heirs. It's refreshing to see this, and I also love how Sophia is just all this, not this strict young woman. She has emotions. She's very human. She's getting into fights with Charles, and you can feel the emotional strain of the murder and suspicion and the will stuff taking its toll on her. I enjoyed her brief fights with Charles. It plays off the usual Christie idea that true love is worth fighting for, and she gets into these fights because she loves Charles. Again, I don't find Sophia necessarily the most interesting or entertaining character, but I think she is expertly drawn in the role she's playing. And Edith is yet another great character. I think when people think of Crooked House and they think of Edith de Havilland, they think of her as this nice old woman who sacrifices herself. And that's not really the case. We're told everyone in this family is ruthless, including Aunt Edith, who is not a Leonidas. She's not really that nice of a person. Charles Christie loves playing this trick with older women. Edith doesn't like Aristide, and she's kind of mean to other people. It's unclear when she figures out it's Josephine, but I suspect it's probably pretty early on. And the way she goes about this is interesting. She's trying to let Josephine get away with it, but she doesn't know how. And even when Brenda and Lawrence are arrested, she does try to help Brenda, but it's extremely callous of her to say Lawrence should still be hanged, but she was willing to let Lawrence take the fall for this, though she does change her mind when Josephine poisons Nanny. There are moments where Edith comes off as an unlikable person, but always as a great character. Philip Leonidas is probably one of the lesser characters in the book, outside of Nanny. But even then, I think he's a good character. He's not really a dud. He's just not as fascinating as the rest. He's the younger son of Aristide and father of Sophia, Eustace, and Josephine, husband of Magda. And because he's the second son and he's, married to this big personality and he has these weird children, he's overlooked a lot, and that caused him to withdraw into these really boring histories no one cares about. He doesn't actually do that much in the book, but I did find him a little funny in the way he just doesn't take any interest in anything that's happening, including meeting his future son-in-law. We get nothing from his perspective about Josephine or even like his wife Magda. He mostly just tries to throw Roger under the bus, which he comes across as like overdoing it a bit much. He's also the only Leonidas who's willing to admit that he thinks it's Brenda to the police. The rest push the narrative to Charles and to the others, but like clam up towards the actual police because they don't think she really did it. Philip in that regard comes off as petulant and not in control of his emotions. His withdrawn status means he misses the fuller picture, just like Josephine, actually. Magda Leonides, stage name Magda West, is such a fun character. We barely see her actually, and it's for the best. She is so over the top that less is more. If she had a heavier presence, I think the book would suffer, despite how good of a character she is. She's an actress, but an actress who is innocent in this book. Not usually the case for Christie. She treats everything as an audition, and it's fantastic. Sophia has a great line that she says she can keep her mother in check if Sophia acts like the director because Magda always wants to please the director. During her questioning, she acts like she's in a monologue on the stage. My favorite moment from her is when the police show up to tell her Josephine and Edith were in a car crash and perished, and Magda once again just has to treat the death of her preteen daughter as if she's playing this dramatic role. It never ends for her. She desperately wants to play poisoner Edith Thompson, and now that Aristide was poisoned, she thinks it's the perfect time to do it because the public will be intrigued. Christie writes her very well. It's difficult to pull off this kind of personality without it becoming cartoonish, and she does not come off as cartoonish. Eustace Leonidas is probably like another one of those lesser characters in the book. He barely appears, and he's this sullen teenage boy who contracted polio and is paralyzed. There is some ableism thrown his way. He doesn't have a lot to do. He's sort of like the decoy suspect because Christie uses him to hint that we should be looking at a child but misdirects us toward Eustace. Eustace has the most vitriol towards his grandfather, which makes him a pretty big suspect, actually. Aristide didn't want Eustace to go back to school because of his disability when Eustace wanted to go back. It's not clear exactly the extent of Eustace's disability, but it is implied that he can move around on his own and is somewhat independent. Like, we're told he's in a wheelchair at one point, but he's also seen walking around. It does feel like as if his family is holding him back from his recovery a little bit. I think Christie could have done more with Eustace, but it's not a big deal to me because this book is of extremely high quality already, and fiddling around, could cause the quality to dip quite a bit. Roger Leonidas, yet again, a great character. The older son who is a lousy businessman. We see quite a bit of Roger, who feels like this very milquetoast personality. He's obsessed with impressing his father, and maybe a little bit too much. He doesn't really live his own life, and he lets his father down in his mind. Aristide agrees to give Roger the money to cover the debts, and isn't disappointed in his son, but Roger just cannot shake it. And I think it's Roger's failures to run the catering business that lead Aristide to put Sophia in charge of the estate based on merit and not the rights of primogeniture. And it's because of Roger's own failures that he and his wife Clemency cannot be happy. They're not happy in Three Gables. They don't care about wealth. They just want to be left be, and Roger's inability to do that is hampering them. Clemency, a very good character. It appears in Christie's notebooks that Clemency was the leading suspect to be the murderer. It's difficult for people to wrap their heads around Clemency and how much she just doesn't care about money. She's very Spartan. Her part of the house has almost no furniture in it, and it comes largely from her first husband, who was also a scientist, and he died penniless. And she's very happy. She doesn't need all this money. There's a lot of talk about Clemency murdering for her husband's sake, but absolutely not her own. And I think she would have made a great murderer, but I'm glad Christie picked Josephine here. She's the direct opposite of Magda. Whereas Magda is always putting on a show, Clemency never puts on a show. She's always genuine, which is probably a clue she's not the murderer. Murderers are also acting to cover their crimes. Clemency is largely unaffected emotionally by the circumstances of the murder. She's really the only person who doesn't nag at her. I found her constant whining about understanding not why she can't move if the Caribbean was funny. I enjoyed Clemency as a character a lot. She's a little bit of comedic relief even though I don't think she's intentionally that way. Brenda Leonides was one of the standout characters for me. You really feel for her, even though you do also suspect, oh yeah, she's probably a gold-digging hussy. And she married Aristide because she thought she was pregnant by another man who dumped her, And it does really feel like this is like a kind of a suspicious sob story to marry the wealthy man who like happened to own the cafe she worked in. But when you combine that what we know about Aristide, you realize Brenda is genuine. She was married to Aristide for nearly 10 years and by all accounts really did seem to love him. Now, as what happened, Brenda did become attracted to Lawrence Brown, but it was never a case of Brenda like murdering the wealthy old guy to marry the cute poor guy. And then you have the way the family treats her. They mostly ignore her, and it's so cruel. It's not even like a genuine hate. It's hate for hate's sake. They want her to be the murderer because it's just easier for them, and most of them don't even believe she's guilty. They just want the public to think that, so they can move on with their lives. It's the sort of emotional torment that Christie often depicted as worse than physical or outright hatred. Brenda is depicted as dreamily romantic and perhaps a little naive, but no fool. It's very satisfying at the end that she does get her happy ending. Lawrence Brown, to me, was like the biggest surprise of this reread. I was very impressed with his character depiction. Christie does a lot of criticizing of people who play things safe. And even in 1949, conscientious objectors were ridiculed, called cowards, not looked upon highly. I think nowadays we think of conscientious objectors a little differently, but in the aftermath of World War II, they were not looked upon highly, and Christie changes that up here. She does a lot of defending of Lawrence. He's not depicted as a coward, although some characters say that and push that narrative, but Lawrence is a man of genuine principles. He even defends himself with a story of how he once ran into a burning building to save an old woman, but who needed saving himself. He opposed war and genuinely believed his presence in the war would be a detriment to the Allied war effort. He talks about how he'd worry the man he was shooting wasn't going to be a Nazi, and he'd think too much about things and like cause his squad lives. Christie really pushes the point that some people's place in the war wasn't in the war itself. She does a similar thing, though not exactly, with Raleigh Claude and Taken at the Flood, which was published around the same time as Crooked House. Both men are redeemed in the end as not cowards and worthy men. Although the Raleigh Claude version of that story does not end well at all. And there's also this great sort of line in the novel of how Charles is doesn't understand why Brenda is attracted to Lawrence because he's a conscientious objector and he's not this stereotypical alpha male. And Sophia snaps back at him. It's no, Lawrence is actually very attractive to women. You don't see it because you're a man, but a woman would know. And I was surprised at this depiction, and it was very refreshing actually. And that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think about Crooked House. I think Crooked House is a book that deserves a larger legacy than it has. I think fans of Christie recognize this as one of the best, but more casual readers do not. It's not one of those ones you hear talked about a lot. It didn't start the child killer craze, nor do I think it's the influence for future works. And that's fine. Not everything needs to be ubiquitously famous. There is something to be said about a hidden gem about Crooked House. Next week, I will be reviewing Season 1 of Le Petit Meurtre d'Agatha Christie, the French mini-series that adapted some of Christie's works in an interesting way. This will be Season 1, set in the 1930s, and I will also be reviewing Le Petit Meurtre en Famille, which was sort of a 4-part mini-series that led into the creation of this show. So, stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.